thank you for everyone to be here. Today, three of us are co-members from this initiative called Reunion. We'll share some of our thoughts and perspective and what is going on in the system. First, we will start with a video.
There was a windbreak on the way to the beach from the house I was born in. Thick casuarinas kept the cold ocean wind from my village.
Those woods behind me. The trees stood together, a continuous wall, their own beings. Surrounding the village, surrounding the people. Leaves and branches crossing each other, connecting with each other.
So much with each other, they are never uniform in their consciousness and appearance.
Everyone in this city has a different identity in another person's space-time. Often, one identity exchanges, converses, debates, and reconciles with another. Every individual is a metaphor or a prophecy. Every time we were going to present a change, people in the city exchanged goods, time, relationships on the shoreline. All these faces flashing by, those who once stayed in this space-time. It always ends up with a wave of trees in that distant memory, flagging gently against the land.
Okay. Hello. Thanks for having us. My name is Genevieve Costello. I am a cultural researcher and PhD candidate at Royal Holloway, University of London. And for the past 10 months, I've been collaborating on the Reunion Project and its concept development and ethics of care. Most of my time has been spent in Google Docs and Skypes with designer and strategist Aiwen, to my right, my immediate right, and also Reunion's initiator, and with curator and researcher Mi Yu, Reunion social developer, on my far right. This morning we will have an overview of about 15 minutes that I will make about why care is a resource and one that concerns us all. Then Aiwen will give us a 10-minute overview of the Reunion system. And then the three of us will talk for about 45 minutes about Reunion's approaches to care, peer-to-peer, and the commons. And then we will open up for discussion and questions with you all. Okay. On care. Theories of care nearly all start with the premise that all humans have needs that others must help them meet. We are inherently interdependent. I use the term care here in its broadest sense, as posited by political theorist Joan Tronto, as the practice of maintaining, continuing, or restoring the world. Such a premise is tangible. We can all pull up examples of when we need help and provide help. It is also abstract. Care is a shared but not equalizing or consistent need. It is attached to our condition. We are vulnerable beings. And it is a fundamental action and tool for our immediate and generational subsistence and well-being. Our needs for care and our ability to give care change all the time in our day-to-day and periods of life. They change between individuals and between peoples. Our conceptions of how we are able to put care into practices and how we are able to receive it is fickle. It is situated. It takes different shapes when employed in different cultures and different times and with different ends in mind. Tronto outlines 4 stages of care in practice. These are caring about, so the noticing for the need of care in the first place. This might be seeing a homeless person on the street. Taking care of, so assuming responsibility for the care. This might be offering this person some euros. Caregiving, so the actual conducting of the work of care that needs to be done. So this might be then taking this person to a shelter for the evening. And care receiving, the response of the person cared for. Was the care sufficiently received? Was it the shelter that this person wanted? Along with this method, Tronto provides 4 attributes and ethics associated with the full scope of care. These are attentiveness, responsibility, competence, and responsiveness. As we all have the need for care, and most of us the capacity to learn the skills to enact it, I propose that care is a common resource. Care is a resource which people orchestrate and manage with shared values, rules, and negotiations. As much as the types of orchestration and management, that is, the systems and institutions, social forms, shape and change the value of the resource of care. In the hegemonic orchestration of capitalism, stages of care have been divided up, individualized, privatized, with the aim to achieve socioeconomic ends of the accumulation of a workforce for capital gain. Expanding upon Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, in which the processes of expropriation and dispossession of commoners separated people from their means of production, commencing in the 1500s, Silvia Federici argues that gender division of labor, what is often referred to as productive and reproductive labor, the creation of an unwaged, devalued, depoliticized, and privileged and privatized informal economy taking shape within the institution of the domestic household or family to support the formal economy, associated as distinct from the family, were all implicit in this major shift from a subsistence economy to a wage labor economy. Care provisioning has been housed, enclosed, in terms of this presiding socioeconomic formation, rendered invisible, or as an intimate haven producing the very real human needs broadly associated with, whether realized or not, trust, security, and love. During the centuries-long era of primitive accumulation, there were extensive persecutions against women and exploitations and enslavement of peoples in the peripheral spheres. We see isolation and extensions of care labor grounded in the atomized household, the exclusion of women from wage labor and property, the naturalization of care labor and domestic space to women, the degradation of reproductive work and social body of the woman, and the expulsion of women from knowledge, including medicinal practices and control over bodies. By being marked as naturally inferior, naturalizing care as a disposition rather than skills and labor, women were forced to be the unwaged servants to the male workforce. We see this devaluation of the care labor associated with spheres of care. As Nancy Fraser articulates, there is an inherent contradiction between care and capitalism. This is a system that simultaneously disavows care, yet wholly relies on it. Today, we continue to see the cycle of depletion, outsourcing, and neglect of care. Arguably, then, the common resource of care was and continues to be literally and ideologically captured, enclosed, procured into a system for surplus value, being treated as an infinite natural resource and rendering it in crisis through its devalorization, hyper-individualization, and privatization within our foundational, intimate social systems. Care pervades all spheres of life. It is commoning. It is necessary for any social system in any sphere at any scale. Care as an illegitimate commodity, though, is divided between gender, class, race, and ethnicity, and is predominantly hidden under the normative orders and various guises of the household, family, kinship, or the affordances to make enough money to find market solutions that continue to perpetuate poor conditions for other peoples and other common resources, or the stigmatization of the inability to take care, that is, to simply embody our penultimate vulnerable state. Yet, there is a fifth stage of care that Toronto posits about a decade later: caring with. Caring with being emblematic of caring as being a democratic practice, a political issue, elemental to our recognized social identity and responsibility. I argue that, at least conceptually, caring with circumvents the other stages. It implicates care as a collective obligation and its authentic value as a basic need that is unownable. Rather than stagnantly residing within the prescribed identity roles of care for its accumulation in a commodity exchange economy, it is a civic, person-to-person, horizontal responsibility to enable people to be able to conduct with agility the full spectrum of the stages and elements of care in practice for the valorization of care as a common resource. To inform an interrelational, ongoing, collectively determined socioeconomic system. Thus, reunion starts with care as a commons to expand upon these enclosed normative spheres and groups of care provisioning. Our project, Reunion Network, then, is about the support of autonomously determined structures of interrelations, caring with, We underscore them. We are their champion by providing them with a technological infrastructure, a social framework, and philosophical grounding. We consider how we could become more comfortable and confident in being aware of, trusting in, responding to, and sharing with others in all the unique roles and interrelations that arise in our life situations that we choose, rather than the ones that are simply familiar and prescribed, the roles which we have learned to mold ourselves. Reunion works across 3 scales of interrelations: relationships with ourselves, relationships between people, and relationships between many relationships. These are distinct and additive. Moving away from the domination of institutionalized relationships requires an evolution of many concepts. Conceptions of time, value, work, how we communicate, exchange, what of our lives is rendered meaningful. Admittedly, this is a demanding approach. We are asking a lot of people, and it is because we want to complicate assumptions, to tease, even if just a little bit, and only in people's imaginations, deep systemic change. To trust in ourselves, our peers, our cultivations, and environments of care, and their infinitely changing natures. Now Aiwen will give us an overview of the reunion system. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. So basically, I would sort of like have you a walkthrough of like some basic feature as a user, the sort of like the kind of journey that you walk through in the reunion system. Just so you know, this project started in 2017, so it has been like really growing as like an all-encompassing project. Within this introduction, I cannot go through all the features. I only mostly mention the things that we in later will be repeatedly mentioned in our discussion. If you're interested, you can go to our website to see like there's like 16,000 words of essay there that talk about all the implication and technical features, but that's that. And so what does it mean if you join Reunion Network? As a new user, when you join Reunion Network, the first thing that the system will ask you is to set up a relationship with yourself. And that's first and foremost and also permanently undissolvable relationship that you will have in the system. Under this relationship, you can add activities simply as like feeding yourself. But this first relationship really work as like the safeguarding of your well-being while you're also caring with each other. Making other agreements with other people. The basic idea is that we can only have a good relationship with other people when we have a good relationship with ourselves. So within that self-relationship, basically it also it works as a safeguarding in terms of like first when you're adding too many relationships within the system, and automatically the self-relationship receives less time, and so like there will be like the system will also like somehow remind you that you might spend too little time for yourself, and then that might prompt you to a need to reorganizing your life and relationship with other people. Or there's other possibility is when your overall time spending is become too fragmented. You'll have to deal with too many relationships, and each of them receive too little attention. That will also prompt you to rethink about reorganizing your life, basically. But like that kind of like, of course, that kind of guidance or notification is very minimal in the system because. Most importantly, I think within our system, we also, through the lens of care, we want to understand how we can actively care for each other while like we have the maximum agency in there. Because within the current, most of the digital services we encountered for, there's so much that the digital system wanted to do for you so that you don't need to think about it. But then we actually consider that is especially dangerous when we're trying to approach care. It actually needs our own kind of agency and our own active role in there. So the system needs to be very conservative in terms of all this kind of guidance there. And you notice the difference between activity and relationship. That is also like two types of contract exist in the system. The relationship is like the sort of like mother contract, and then the activity exists under the relationship. That idea also trying to express the idea that a relationship is very often addressed through the exchange and activity we do for each other, but the sum of the activity doesn't equate a relationship. And within that relationship, when you're signing this contract with either with yourself or with other people, there also it builds on blockchain in terms of like trying to use the programmable money to sort of rethink how we can organize the economy differently. So there's also like this I need to go through, like there's two types of token work in tandem in the system. One is the personal token that generates by activity. When whatever you do, that you're trying to mark that in the system, it automatically generates this personal token is strictly owned by you, related to you. It doesn't own by any other people. So it's like sort of like symbolic recognition in the system for you about like the emotional investment, the kind of invisible labor that you put in, and the system recognizes that. But then this personal token is not tradable unless you combine it with another person's personal token and become a composite coin. You compose them together, and then so this composite coin became like the symbol of a well-being of a relationship, and you can only spend them together. So you do the care for each other, and then it contributes to the well-being of a relationship, and that well-being being recognized as like having some economic value, not necessarily in the economic value in the sense that we recognize it as financial, but rather how it is like contributing to a circulation and the continuation of a collective economy or something. And so in that sense, like technically, like you put your personal token together, you sign a contract, and then the contract automatically created the kind of personal, the composite coin, and then that over time increases as your care exchange happens within that contract. And additionally, in the relationship, the user also use the color to describe how they feel, the type of time that they will mostly spend on. These two features is sort of our exploration in thinking about different metric on care. For one is that when you like for instance, the color part is a very specific feature trying to explore how you can have an indexless data set that is counterintuitive to a machine logic. So for instance, when you use the color very intuitively to describe how this relationship means to you, that refers to your present moment of personal frame of references. And so, for instance, if in this room everyone is using a color yellow to describe what that relationship means to you, you might mean very different thing. We might all mean very different thing. And then it's not really labelable, and then it's not very descriptable. But then it's precisely how it disrupts the logic of the machine. It cannot process that kind of data because it doesn't work on a common key. So that kind of ambiguity, it also opens up the ground for people to having a more open exchange about how they feel about each other, how they care about each other, like very obviously opposing to like any 5-star rating or something. So, and also this kind of like sort of like conditioning is extremely important in terms of like when you want to think about ongoingness of a relationship. You don't want a system to position as somewhat a very judgmental position there to talk about your relationship. Rather, when you have this kind of very subjective data and then they render it together, you as a person will actually being able to have a very intimate relationship to that rendering and to that kind of data to you. It only mean like have meanings to you. So you are also your best judge. in that sense. So it's a way to trying to counter the idea of like quantifying self-movement, but rather focus like trying to think about how we can, like in that sense that we know more about each other and then we can care about each other better. And within each contract, you basically have, you always like check on this, set a checkpoint, because that marks it provides that kind of idea for everyone, that the awareness to everyone that like a relationship is never monolithic and static, but it's actually ongoing. It has a contradictory feature, like its ongoingness is dynamic, but at the same time it also, especially when it comes to a long-term relationship, it also comes with planning. So in a sense, the checkpoint, trying to find balance and sort of like technical support for that, like when you reach almost reaching the checkpoint that people can, like the system will prompt you to negotiate, to discuss, like to review what has happened and then what you wanted to continue in the future. And if you decide that like this is maybe it's best for us that so that like deformalizing this relationship, if the contract can dissolve, or if you think that like further steps can be taken, or for, like different steps can be taken, then you create a new contract, etc., etc., or you just let it dissolve and then continue with other people, and like that. This stage is called contract stage 2, and before you sort of like put the money and the personal token and combine it to composite coin, before you do that, that was a contract stage first, which doesn't really require any kind of commitment in a sense, and then like after 1 year of the contract stage 2, then you can actually apply to become a contract 3 stage, which will really link to government welfare, because that was basically our ultimate goal or hope, that trying to work with local government to ask them to recognize this kind of like informal care relationship that doesn't capture by established institutions such as marriage and family. So basically, like when you have this 1 year commitment to each other and then want it to continue in the same way, then you can apply to government welfare, and then it goes on the same process. But then like only this time, like the care value that you have been circulate within your relationship is recognized by the state through financial means. But that's basically an overview of like different kind of contract stage. You have like different level of liabilities, and then like the limits that you might have, and then you also have some basic community obligation. And then last but not the least is actually we talk a lot, we're trying to structure a kind of infrastructure for informal care exchanges within like people's intimate relationship, but like how does that being able to expand on other field? That means that reunion also should think about how to facilitate between informal care and ideally with like cooperative economy. In that sense, we're also hoping that especially within the CS3 stage, when government is like investing on informal care relationships, so you can see through this kind of diagram that actually like the cooperative can also benefit from this kind of scheme, because for the user in the reunion, they're basically feeling like they can exchange good with the informal care they have been given to each other, and so that like. So basically, it means that you do care for your parents, and then at the same time you actually can get that as a credit to exchange goods and services for that relationship as well. So, and then the benefit for the cooperative is that usually a cooperative having a really hard time in terms of like giving equal market price comparing to other corporate means who get more fundings or capitals to offset their actual spending in order to expand the market. Cooperative usually cannot do that. They don't have that kind of level of funding. And then government also like have a difficulties to directly invest on that because that will also like induce some kind of like market competition issues, etc. But then within the scheme that actually for the government they incentivize a more like they kind of like helping people to create a wider safety net in the precarious time, but at the same time they also simulate a cooperative economy that is more situated in the local, because after all, care cannot really do it. So, like, most of the care cannot do it remotely or digitally. You have to be very present. You have to be very local. So all that is like the basic features that I can walk through. And
cool.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we do this without the mics? Is that possible? Is that okay? Can we do this without the mics? Can I just talk very loudly? Can everyone hear me?
Or maybe it's about the video.
Oh, okay.
It's probably about
Okay.
video.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll do my best with holding the mic.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I want to transition just into a brief follow-up. I would love to hear, Aiwen, more about how you feel like you're using care to motivate a commons-based economy.
I think that for me, care is like you talked very briefly earlier. Like care is like very specific. It's very person-based. It's like really based on the local. You need to be very present, and then even the identity or like it always happened with it like in a present moment that is part of an ongoing history. So like that kind of dynamic, that kind of thing that is like not reproducible, and that non-reproducible ability is in a way that like it's very important to think about alternative economy, when most of the economy that we know now are much more situated are much more working with, like, let's say the machine, or working with capitalism, which are relying on mass production, right? So that mass production eventually is about taking away, reducing all this kind of like particular moments or particularity of the identity of the moments, and then so that you will be able to reproduce and then sell it to as many people as possible. And care quite practically cannot do, even though a lot of people trying to reproduce that through like providing robot caregiver, etc. Not trying to say that robots cannot give care, but rather to point to the fact that even a robot gives care, the care that this robot will give is also very specific and very moment-based, right? So in that sense, like care it itself, if we wanted to receive quality care, it's a professional skill, but it's also very emotional and intimate and very moment-based and person-based. So in that sense, like, yeah, as a labor, it has such a particularity that we think that there's so much more that need to explore, other than like just trying to find a way to just like reproduce care again. But rather we should take in care as like the focal point to think about, if we imagine we care about care the most, and then everything else is organized around it, what would that system, what would that economy look like?
I'd like to just come in on this very passionate defense of care by bringing in actually a counterexample. Alvia Volk, who is a Berlin and New York-based writer who used to actually work here at the Transmediale, recently released a soft sci-fi called Oval, in which the protagonist, so it's set in the future Berlin, and Berlin, the near future, where a lot of artists work for corporates as consultants, and one of them, the protagonist, proposed to design a drug that is supposed to enhance the empathy of the intakers. So the drug essentially is built on this hormone that allows you to create bindings with people around you, and that for the protagonist is supposed to help eradicate the poverty in Berlin in the near future. Now that, of course, gives us a lot of problems, other problems, but I like to bring in this counter image exactly in this, what Aiwen just said, as the mass reproduction or reproducibility of care. in this sort of, it's very well intentioned, but it proposes sort of tech solutionist take on things. And we see this in the platform economy, this logic of one size fits all. We see this in national governments when they try to provide a poverty alleviation eradication program. There's always a kind of a one-size-fits-all technocratic solutionism behind that. So I think that brings us really to what reunion is not about, which is not quantifying goodness.
We try to be.
Yes, and really highlights for us how care is a situated practice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this was maybe when I first started working with Reunion. This was maybe one of the things that I kept trying to get my mind to wrap around, is the idea of the maybe tokenizing care relations, or the activities are sort of accumulated, but at the same time, none of these activities equate to the relationship. But I really liked that they're all situated within the diffusion of care relations instead of between the current division of either family, so an informal sort of network of care, like the main site that we're traditionally in society meant to receive care from, and then in the dichotomy of with a formal site for receiving care, so either between the state or the market. And basically, we are not able to be with this ambiguity that we receive care in our everyday. So we have a certain set of roles that we know how to make sense of, what's attached to my role as a sister, or as a friend, or as someone at work. But in the end, care labor is pervasive, it's ambiguous, and it's in all spheres of life. And in this sense, I find that the peer-to-peer relations need to be bolstered as entities, and also with all kinds of entities, so not just human to human, about how to be with this ambiguity and to see the pervasiveness of care and care labor in all of our relations. And again, becoming more comfortable in those different kinds of exchanges, that it might not be lifelong, that it might be year to year, that there are different spheres of life, and that we don't need to tack onto them in this current, I guess, grander system that they exist in. And for me, this is emblematic of a different kind of exchange that can be permitted in a peer-to-peer system, where the other person cannot be conceived as a threat. So in our current system, anytime you have anything outside of the roles, it's justice-based. So we accumulate this idea of care, that we have to have care in these two spheres. And if we are not going to be able to have it in the informal and formal formats, then we are out of social security, that we're insecure. And that any other entity then would be a threat in this sense, to our ability to access it if they're not fitting into one of those categories. So instead of feeling constantly precarious in a precarious condition, because we don't have these sort of traditional frameworks, but to then understand and have access to frames and contracts and relations that can diffuse the pressure on ourselves and in our relationships, and to permit a different kind of exchange that's about interrelational exchange rather than right or wrong or fitting into these sort of set frameworks. And I see this occurring in our system by this sort of active encouragement of affirmative consent and active negotiation. So this is happening regularly with contract making, with being reflected through these certain stages, first a relationship with yourself and how you have to describe it. So being more comfortable with the ambiguity of care in our everyday, in our feelings and emotions, and then maybe no feelings and emotions, but just the specific labor of making food for yourself in the morning or doing something at work. So we were trying to I think the system sort of responds to this, and I think that address is also becoming more comfortable within these power dynamics that are often reserved and stay stagnant within certain roles that we fulfill in the existing sort of dichotomy. Do you want to jump in here?
Thanks for the very hard turn. That's great. Ambiguity, of course, it only works in a very contextual relationship-based thing. Like that's also one of the why we can actually do the color marking in that sense, like because they work on interpersonal scale. So it doesn't really have the need of the usual mass communication demand, like you need to have a legible kind of like communication key that everyone understands. And like for me, like I have been working on this kind of theory for a really long time about like mass communication. It itself, like it's basically trying to empower the kind of capitalist society that is very trying to be, everything should not be super situated, but rather it should be like universal. It can like is like transferable in any kind of sense. Ideally, like everything is reproducible. But so in that sense, it also informs how digital service has been designed, right? It's always the kind of same approach, even the kind of science fiction that you talk about, that it's like still working on the kind of assumption about like, oh, what would be the reproducible solution once for all? Like everyone would be happy then. Like no one would be actually happy because everyone, of course, like know that their particular moment of vulnerability and then needing support from very particular people as well. So in a sense, like, I think the kind of like even like there's so many social media that has been designed for like connecting people, but the logic is still so much like trying to like really base on mass communication in a very particular sense that like assuming that we all have the kind of like same kind of structure of life and having the same kind of way of engaging people, and then eventually we're all just like attaching to just like a number of followers. That kind of idea is actually it's an active violence in the sense that it kind of like assuming everyone is a reproducing bits, right? So in a sense, also it's also about power issue because the power when a society or our relationship being structured in an ideally monolithic way, then it also means that we are actually not engaging with each other, but we are actually engaging with a larger structural demand that we were talking about this like personal moment. My struggle with my mother is always about she having a very particular image about like what would be a good daughter or what kind of love that she would like to receive from me. Which like she at the moment that it really feels really difficult that she's not actually engaging with me, but rather engaging with a larger system. So in that sense, like that kind of care, in a way that like it would become like I would be forcing, because I love her, I have to be forced to engage with the system again. So eventually it's about how we are no longer, we are being taken away of the agency to directly dealing with each other, but we have to like channel through a larger system. So the question will be like, or at least my personal wish is that whether reunion or like reunion as a proposal, whether we can actually find a way that like we need structure, we need a system to support us, but like does that has to mean that we has to give up part of our agency, and also like there seems to be some kind of trade-off that like we seems to be like constantly believe in, but doesn't necessarily. I just feel that it doesn't have to be that way. Like for instance, that earlier you talk about the carriers, it actually like very often being considered as a personal choice. Like we all you're traveling so much, it seems to be a personal choice. You are participating in a gig economy is not because you don't have other choice, but precisely because you have too many choices. But this actually all kind of, the kind of like of things that like paralyze us to think about what would be the other possibility. Like I wanted to have a society that I can be free, but doesn't mean that I need to be alone, So in a way that like to creating the kind of like structure that is actually quite precisely focused on relationship itself, and then like to knowing that like even you and the relationship with yourself doesn't necessarily define you, and then let alone like the relationship you're involved in doesn't necessarily defines you. And so like that implies a kind of like different kind of power, and then at the same time it's also about like an establishment of a relationship is always about two people's consent. You cannot have a relationship just like by one person. Actually in the system, it can recognize you, like having a relationship with a phantom person, and then you can create as much personal token just with that, but it doesn't render into the economy because you have to consent with the other person and create a composite coin in order to participate in the economy, right? But then so that actually trying to actively giving the kind of 50-50 veto power with all the parties within the relationship, which is just two people basically. But then to imagine a community that is actually not defined by a central narrative about what who are we, what our community is about, which always lead to a potential dangers, marginalizing certain kind of people. Certain people have more says about what we are than the others. But to imagine a community that is actually accumulation of continuous P2P relations, that which everyone has theoretically have 50-50 veto power, and then you also doesn't necessarily mean to risk compromise the community because the community itself is not strictly defined. It doesn't have a strict border, but it's very flexible. So yeah, so that's basically for me, P2P is an organizational structure. They're trying to restructure the power, and then that is more centering around care. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
really does.
Sorry.
So what Genevieve talked about in terms of diffusing care and that leading to different exchange systems, and what Aiwen just talked about in terms of how can we engage in relationships, interpersonal relationships that have this sort of P2P quality without having to engage with a larger system that pertain to the social norms and often follow market logic. I think that leads me to think about also the peer production of value and essentially how we're creating or proposing an alternative value system here. So from anthropological research, I'm kind of synthesizing everything from Marcel Mauss to Ajahn Appadurai to Benjamin Lee more recently, who have looked at gig economies in traditional societies. You can trace the making or the production of value as starting from inalienable exchanges among individuals, right? So we have to unpack that. Inalienable exchanges and then individuals. Individuals are, of course, an anthropological term that has also been popular in French theory circles, which it signals this sort of sub-individual level. So we think that individuals are not divisible, but they are actually divisible, and we are being rendered into actually individuals under the capture of course, surveillance capitalism. But there is another earlier version of individuals, and that being in this traditional societies where people engage in inalienable gift exchanges, and their roles are temporarily attributed to them, depending on what kind of exchange they are engaged in. So thinking about the fluidity of subjectivities, of identities, of roles, and how that over the time has been rendered or subjected into alienable exchanges and increasingly money-mediated alienable exchanges among individualized agents. So that's sort of how, in a nutshell, how the value has been captured in this alienated exchange. So in a way, what we're trying to do is to rewire this movement and to put more agency back into inalienable circulation. And that is to say, in this qualitative relationships, when both parties, being individuals, are engaged in a kind of labor that is not commodified labor. So there has been also serious revaluation of value. We've seen how value is created, is subject to inalienation, and how that is mediated increasingly by price. Modern economics actually started out as a much broader study of the society, but over the course of the 20th century has been increasingly reduced to mathematical models. So everything is mediated by price. That leads to philosophers like Randy Martin and Brian Massumi to ask, why are we still using price as the index for value, right? Why are we not using social value, environmental value, wonder, zest? All of these are post-capitalistic values, and all of these exist in abundance in our society. And I like to also mark here that we were talking about the personal token and composite coin, especially the personal token. Really, it's theoretically limitless because precisely because it is issuing from ourselves and is issuing from this abundance that exists in the society. So to be sure, there were proposals for social accounting and social indicators already in the 60s. Allende, the Chilean CyberSim project, also had a component that tried to quantify citizens' level of happiness. So all of these are, of course, quite dangerous in that they risk proposing another normative frame as to what is happiness. It has also been discussed at Davos times again, including at the recent Davos, that if we should actually measure happiness instead of GDP. Interesting questions for smart people's world leaders, but yeah, I would be really interested in how they actually want to propose that frame of measuring happiness. So in short, we don't need another normative metrics for this qualitative relationships, but we should encourage the practice of this in common.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to how do we approach the commons. I think one thing that I like that you bring up about the gift economy is the idea and the importance of articulating the difference between reciprocity and contributive, and that there's a lot of issue around this, and we think about like the sharing economy and contemporary platforms where this capturing of our multiplication of the self, but we aren't embodying because we have a single user profile and have this stagnant identity, and I think it's similar that just to emphasize that the ability to access and be familiar with the things that are all of the things that we exchange and that we contribute, that like Jody Dean articulates in communicative capitalism, where sort of the attributes that are central to democracy are materially manifesting on sort of digital communication technologies. And I find that the same is true for care, and that it's being captured in sort of the presentation, I guess, of how we need to be in the contemporary economy that's, I would say, just an era of precarity, where we are very good at being agile and we're very good at being social, and it's a mandate in nearly all of the jobs that you might have to be skilled at reading rooms and knowing what you need to deliver socially, and that is often rendered as care labor. And I find that this is too easily occurring and not enough addressed, this role of care and its pervasiveness, especially in contemporary commons movements. Not all, but a lot of the discussion that's sort of around this like very common definition, which I also ascribe to, but these sort of three interlinked and interdependent elements of that are active. So a community or a group of people that manages a specific resource, so that would be the second element, and the rules and negotiations created and practiced by the community in order to manage this resource. I think that this happens all the time. We are perpetually making commons, but then they're perpetually captured. And this isn't addressed in terms of care labor enough, I think, especially in these ideas of the partner states. I'm thinking like the peer-to-peer foundation, these sorts of very like neutral, accessible, making accessible the idea of commoning, and having that as the idea of having a partner state and sort of working with the existing social orchestrations. And although a lot of the times these arguments are sort of made in terms of, oh, you know, we need ideas of how the social orchestration, but we're not actually given any sort of provisions of formal labor. Especially, I think this is dangerous if we're talking about working with a partner state, either whether it's articulated like a transition movement, or even worse in my mind, that it's not articulated like that, that we just keep collaborating with the state to make these commons that sort of just continue to coexist. So I find that very problematic. And yeah, so maybe we want to jump in.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure. Like that's also one of the reasons that we have this. Like we get a lot of question about like the contract stage 3, right? Like let me go back to that. Like this part, like the contracts, yeah. So like you see the CS1 is basically practically just risk free. You just like explore everything, and then like in CS2 you basically can explore with another person, and then the CS3 beyond like exploring within each other, you also need to explore the kind of like dynamic with the government in a way that trying to open the ground like the kind of like social structure can be organized bottom up, and then like but then at the same time you're also, because you're asking for also like financial welfare recognition from the state, and then at the same time also like trying to work on blockchain as almost like very kind of like practical move in terms of like blockchain still is like one of the best tool to provide programmable money, and then it's the only way that like the personal token and composite coin works in tandem. It can only work in a digital sense. Like you can't use paper money like that. I mean, unless I don't know, but I think that like you can't use like the kind of traditional money that doesn't really do the work. But at the same time, it always come back with the question like, what about privacy? What about like even with like just like to measuring the metric of like we talk about informal care, but then at the same time there's also like we're trying to find new value metric, and then but also work with government. How does that power dynamic works? Like how what precisely is the kind of mechanism that can protect us from our for our best interest, but at the same time also like just like from a very practical note, a government has a responsibility to make sure the welfare that they distributed is somewhat authentic, right? Even though authenticity is quite a big question in terms of when you're evaluating someone else giving care to another person. So like, how does that actually work? Like, we don't know. We actually just like starting from this kind of this like new phase to just like trying to discuss with government. We're trying to work with their current interests in terms of like how it actually all governments around the world has to think about the aging society. Like how do we actually work with that, and then how do you actually like not ending up with a society just full of alienated aging people who doesn't even has been educated to learn how to collaborate. Like compromise becomes such a cause in our individualized, atomized society because the economy is more promoting the alienated exchange, alienated value. So we actually didn't really get into the kind of culture that educate us to be more tolerant, to work with others, like how to learn to make compromise and all this kind of thing. So in a way that like CS3, it's like sort of like this kind of like object that sort of like is very attracting to a lot of problem. And then how do we actually being able to make a good balance? Like I imagine that balance will always be like up and down and like very precarious. But at the same time, that kind of tension is very needed. Like I mean, even within a care relationship, that kind of like ongoing unbalancedness is part of the balance, right? So like at the same time, for a system that also work with that, it also like will have the responsibility to make sure the balance didn't go off track, but at the same time, you also, you just need to deal with that. And at the same time, of course, like also trying to go with this kind of like facilitating value exchange between a cooperative economy and also like informal economy that is somewhat more intimate, and like how does that value exchange flow? Basically, we don't know exactly how it will work. It's just like we can only go through like pilot and local research, work with like many entities, etc. But yeah, I guess I completely agree the kind of problem that you point out, and basically within Reunion we just like have this like very specific framework that's trying to see if that is a viable proposal, right? But yeah.
Yeah, no, this is the most difficult question.
Yeah.
But to backtrack to backtrack a little bit, our approach to the commons is not to just regard it as resources, be it tangible or intangible, or not just look at this practice of the commoning as in managing the access and decision making within these commons, but also to always reiterate this labor perspective, because commoning is outside of the commodified labor market. Now, it was mentioned before, Silvia Federici, who has this amazing book called, people always get the title wrong, so it's not Wages for Housework, but Wages Against Housework. Because wages are needed, but wages are not enough, precisely because wages of the housework is housework is beyond wage labor and beyond commodifiable labor. Even if most recently the Oxfam Foundation has put the global value of care work rendered by women, and that is actually not all of the care work that is rendered by the human beings, globally at 3 times the value of the tech industry combined. But that still is not enough when we deal with the interface with the government, because once again we find ourselves reduced to the metrics and to the numbers of the GDP and of market value. So what I think what we are going to try out in the near future is to look into, of course, programmable money with the different stages to see how this multi-issuer community currency can contribute to a value system that is where everyone is more engaged in this contributory relation to the community well-being than in this individualistic, alienable exchanges and transactions. Yes, with that,
Yeah, I think we would love to open it up for a conversation or any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and for this project. I think it's super inspiring. I have a question. So I'm working sort of designing for the future of nursing, you could say. So also working with care, but in the more sort of professional domain. And I understand the distinction you're making between the more informal and the more formalized and maybe professional. But still, I think there are some really interesting examples where you also see, I think, some of the mechanisms that are really interesting in your project. And you see there is this, there's been these pilot cases in Netherlands, maybe you're familiar with, where they tried to sort of make this decentralized caregiving thing, where instead of having people caught up in this like endless hierarchy of new public management, you just give, maybe I think it's like 12 people, just like total autonomy to figure out how they want to give care. And it was massively successful. And I just see, I think it's very interesting when you see some of this idea of like decentralized organizations seeping into professional care. So my question to you is whether you see some of everything you presented here, if you see a potential for that to sort of seep into a more professional domain as well, and also how you see all this happen sort of in the future in terms of how this could maybe blend or maybe go into two different directions or so on.
Yeah, totally. Like, actually, this co-op at first it was like really about care or consultancy for relationship, etc. It was because like the PT and CC basically that mechanism is trying to make everyone to like you accumulate the fund and then like you kind of like have a fund for a relationship per se. And then like what does that mean? Like it means that we wanted you to spend that money for the good wellness of your relationship. So that means like usually like you go for consultancy or you establish a care relation, like let's say like child care relation as like the most banal example, and then like at one point that neither of you have time for that, so like you go for a local service to purchase that, like to subsidize the care that you actually need to provide. So in that sense, it definitely like this part is trying to like make a good relationship and with that. And at the same time, it's also, you see here is like the co-op also serve as a service point for addressing migrant and loneliness issue. Our ideal scenario would be like the cooperative can become like this kind of service point that if you move to a new city, or actually you already fall off any kind of like social network in the local, then you still have this like go-to place, and then you can use your personal token to combine with another person's within the co-op, and then they being the hand holder for you to helping you to get back on the grid, or just like to pay different kind of services and to just like to get help. And then like that is also like very important because like we think that through the CC mechanism, then you're also like very quietly but also quite fundamentally trying to change the power dynamic between a service provider and service purchaser. So like because you're relying on another person's personal token, which is your care provider, the caregiver, then you're actually, it's no longer the kind of like a capitalist logic that you have the money, so you purchase, and then that another person is servicing back to that. It changed the power dynamic because, yeah, the CC, like you're relying on that person's consent in order to make that money work. So in that sense, it's sort of like elevating the social position of care worker. Sorry.
I want to also comment maybe from the other end. We were talking about contributory value systems, and the question is, can you actually introduce this into more professional or social infrastructure, into professional care? And a very crucial component of reunion is actually co-production of service, the fact that you are on par with each other. Which is not the case, right, in the professional care circle, unless you really try to change it. I think there has been practices in the French psychiatry where people try to change the sort of front end, back end, or delivering side and receiving side kind of relation between the caregivers and the patients. But the patients also brought in their own agency in shaping the institution that they were in. So this kind of co-creation and co-production of service, I think, will be interesting to witness also in institutionalized forms.
Is this on? So this is a really thorny kind of question, and I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but I suppose I'm thinking about the way that care operates in societies today, and these kind of relationships that exist where you have certain people who seem much more sort of freely giving of their care, which, as you've mentioned, is often women. And then we have other people who are sort of very accustomed to accepting that care. And I'm wondering how, and I mean, I think this is super, super interesting, and just in terms of kind of heightening people's awareness of, the care services that are being provided for them all of the time. And, and that sort of conceptual, elevating, I think you said, of that service, provision, or of that labour. I guess I'm thinking about things like individual differences and personality differences in certain people, where there's the person in the office who, makes you a cup of coffee and for them that was like a super huge favor that they did for you, even though you maybe didn't ask for it, but you're the one who kind of empties the dishwasher every single morning and you never think about that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like these kinds of, yeah, I guess it's like a readiness to offer care, and you know how that can then, how the system can take that into account when you've got then people using the same tools and one person's writing every single thing that they did for you and it took them, you know, a couple of seconds to do, and they want a personal token for that. And then you've got other people who are, you know, maybe offering actually a lot more but aren't sort of at that same level. And sorry, I know this is long, but also then thinking about negotiation, and there's been sort of a lot of research into, for example, also gender differences, and I'm sure it's very intersectional as well, with other sort of, you know, class and race and things like that. But in terms of people's self-assessments and, you know, how they might value their own contribution to a specific relationship, or, you know, how they then bring that into a negotiation. So there you maybe have certain people who I guess we could fairly probably, you know, accurately map onto a current sort of societal picture, but how those people are sort of overestimating their contribution to a relationship. And I guess I was thinking about that in terms of this, which is, a lot of it is quite kind of self-directed. I understand that the other person has to give consent, but anyway, I just wondered if there was anything you had to say about that aspect of it all.
For sure, thank you. Yeah, I think we definitely acknowledge that we're not working on like some beautiful, already even playing ground, and I think that those dynamics will exist on this platform, and it's kind of the only thing that anyone can really do is change the system in which we're operating, whether that's an education system, the things that we're learning, the things that we're emphasizing, and right now. Yeah, like it is staying in this sort of abstract sense where you have a diffusion of care relations where no one relation or no one sort of chunk of relations, so not just my colleague or this sort of sector, is meant to hold certain elements or exchanges of care. So basically, when you start a contract with someone, you have to articulate together and like fully see what you're agreeing on or not agreeing on, and then there are checkpoints where you have to check in and say, you know, is this working? Is this not working? And why? And basically, it's quite open and ambiguous because we're encouraging people to be able to articulate. Actually, you only contributed money, but I ended up doing all of these sort of other stages of care, and that's not in balance, or that doesn't work. I think as well it's really important to emphasize that those unequal exchanges are inherent to being. Like I think it might be quite common where in some relations that you have, you play this one person might play this kind of this role that's really giving. You're able to play certain elements, but then when you go to another relationship, you might be someone who takes a lot, and that might change in the relationship over time, or it might be that's just the kind of set relationship and then it ended and that's what it was. And so I think that it's a matter of acknowledging that these like dynamics exist instead of having them be invisible. So having the platform be a site or is a network that is the premise of saying that you're meant to be equals, and what does that mean to you in this context? Like define that for yourselves. So it is asking a lot of people, but I think at the same time, this is the kind of the premise of, I guess, like horizontal or non-hierarchized, even in-person, like political groups or these shifts of power. So it's not ever to say that this doesn't exist, but how do we verbalize it and address it instead of having it being hidden? And basically the elements in the system that's the best that I think we can do on a tangible level.
And also I think that that also goes to the self relationship and then the personal token, how they work together, right? Like you may with a designated relationship, you may underestimate your personal tokens that you're worth receiving, but then on the other hand, it might actually because somehow in a way that you might feel actually you are underestimating that, which actually adding more emotional labor for you within your self relationship. So in a way that like that, like maybe you're underestimating that one, but then like it actually in return maybe you'll be sort of like over like adding more tokens in your self relationship on that regard, because you have to somehow navigate in that sense. So like, and then which will actually then will trigger to like the burnout notice, right? Like when you somehow it has this kind of like difficulty. You may have too much of time spending in the back of your mind. Like we actually have like 3 timelines as well. One is like concentrated labor, one is fragmented, repeated labor, and then another one is like the labor in the back of your mind. So like that also like when it's sort of like also notice that, it send you this burnout notice that like there's something might be going wrong there, you might want to look at it. So then you may then have an overview again, and then you see like, oh, maybe I'm like underestimating this relationship which contributing to my own burden, then maybe I need to, talk to that person, or just figure out what's going on, So in a way that like it's all this mechanism trying to be subtle enough, but also like, give you a hint of, but the idea is that you're still being able to judge and then look at it over time. Yeah. I think that question I raised earlier. Yeah.
Time is not so good. So thanks for the talk. Yeah. I have some questions about this mechanism. One is about the color you mentioned, because I don't really think it's different from like rating with stars or words, because it's not really like, for example, if I rate this talk, like if I put 3 or 4 or 5, it doesn't really matter, but what matters is like what's the tendency if I put 3 or 4 or 5, and that characterizes that person. So if I say this is yellow, okay, it's less obvious than stars, but still you can associate with other events, and you can categorize people through that. So it's like the same as labeling. The other thing is, I wonder how flexible is like this specification is like to change, because I think like setting one platform with certain specification is like still you're imposing some kind of system. I mean, it is a system, and it has to change over time, I think, based on feedback or because of that's the nature of things, I think. And if it's possible to change, like how or who is going to regulate this?
Yeah, of course, the second one, no doubt, and that's always the responsibility of a system. And I guess for us, if we were able to really go on within like real life implementation, we expect a lot of change as well. Like, I guess like the only thing that we can impose on us is that we really need to respect the reality, how it works, like how people actually make agreement with each other. Maybe at the end they just like don't need an app for that, which is like very well possible, and I'm happy for that. But then I guess like what we can trying to do is just like to raise possibility of like different ways to organize our life, and on that we'll see like how it can actually being adapted, being taken, or like it may be pointing to a bigger issue because our economy just doesn't work that way. It needs like a more substantial work in the background instead of just like putting out an app or giving out tokens. For the first one, well, let's see how it actually works. I guess the color is like really because it's about like the present moment of your personal frame of references, and it's like it's much less one-dimensional comparing to 5 stars, because like it also the 5-star or even emojis like in a way that you're conflating your personal frame of references with other personal frame of references in like all intertwined together. You conflate it and then reduce it to one metric. And the color trying to do other things, and although the color also like because it doesn't ask you to label, it actually like it just doesn't store your label there. Eventually, it's just like trying to have this kind of a very ambiguous mesh of color that only you yourself have an intuitive feeling about, oh, am I doing okay or something. So in that sense, it's just like, yeah, sure, it could potentially be like not as liberating as we hope for, but like hopefully it opens up some grounds. Yeah. The question at the back.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I just had a question sort of about how this relates to, I guess, like in a future scenario. I'm thinking about like nested contracts and stuff like this, like how we might have a responsibility for care for someone else or a third person because of our care for another person, if that makes sense. I'm just wondering how that's framed within the model that you're working with. Does that make sense? Or
can you rephrase the question? I'm not sure.
Because I'm in a contract with someone, part of my relationship of care might be involved in both of us together providing care for a third person that's outside of that. And I'm just wondering if there's a conceptualization of these like kind of nested relationships and nested contracts.
Yeah, totally. Actually, one of the example that we trying to look at is like childcare, because you're basically on behalf of someone else's well-being. Then you sort of contracting, sharing the labor with someone else. That goes into like you need to provide some kind of like authentication that you're actually allowed to do that. Like for child, maybe like relatively somehow that's easier because. Yeah, you have some sort of like more superior position towards your care. But like, what does it mean for like taking care of your sick parents, or even just like someone who doesn't have like a family or kinship relationship with you, but you somehow, because you have a contract with them, and then you at some point that person needs severe care, then you need to don't know yet, still figuring that out. But that's definitely on our radar. Yeah.
I really like this question because it kind of proposes two different issues. And one, my immediate response is, well, no, every care relation is its own distinct thing, and so it's really important that I would say, even if you are in a relationship and that you're both contributing to the care of another entity that is a singular entity, that you still always have your own relationship with the other singular entity. And if you don't think that you do, then maybe you should think that you should think that you do, because that's distinctly there. But as is this distinct entity of a relationship approaching another relationship. So it's kind of I don't think that we necessarily account for that in the system, but I think that having this self-relationship, there's always this distance between you as an acting body and then like what you're able to actually act on in the world, like is pointing to this this both effect and practice that's always in conglomeration with other relationships. So, and the idea that it's important to understand that that's all occurring, and that you are prioritizing as a choice. You should be conscious of what you're prioritizing as to what you're considering. Are you only looking at your caregiving exchange with this other person through this relationship, and how do you feel about that? Because you do end up having something with that, one-on-one. Yeah, I like that. Thank you.
Are we?
Last question.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Super interesting. Lots of weird ideas in my head because of this diagram you have on the screen. One thing that I wanted to just throw out there is the concept of debt. So already it's been touched on, like this kind of invisibility or unrecognition of certain types of care labor, also associated with kind of the informal economy. I'm wondering how debt maps onto this diagram.
Yeah, this is a very heavy issue between at least Aiwen and I. Yeah, we originally actually started this isn't resolved. We don't have a resolved answer. I'll premise it with that. But I believe that in a contribution based economy, which I think a commons should be formatted as such, or it is inherently that as soon as you have debt as a conception or as a practice, that it's no longer a commons, that hints at accumulation. And the premise of having a back and forth is meant to be contribution-based and not even a reciprocity, which I would even say is starting to hint at debt and accumulation and hoarding, potentially, which that can be in power or in actual activities back and forth. And this is a return to the mechanism of consent and negotiation and checkpoints. And so that, in my mind, there should be absolutely no sense of debt, not even indebtedness, and that we should rid ourselves completely from that as a society and in our relations. And that we should begin instead a conversation about the contribution and what you have received and what that means in terms of ongoingness, because I think that debt is again turning to assumptions of a futurity and a past, and we shouldn't assume at all that the relationships in our exchanges should have a relationship to that in terms of an attachment to those set roles or that set relationship, but instead to the inherent presence of our ongoingness, and that also in ourselves, and then at a whole in society, and then beyond us as people. So, okay, that's my...
So yeah, we have a lot of back and forth on this. For me, I think because the personal token and CC works, like PT and CC works in that way, that you can have like that doesn't really work beyond the relationship. Like you can internally think that like the other person is in that with you, but then like because you need this like ongoing consensus within that relationship in order to make that economy work, so all the kind of debt like that can potentially hoarding it within that relationship, for me, is mostly emotional than financial. So for me, the emotional debt for me is a driving force for continuity of a relationship. You go on if you go on go to a dinner with someone, if you square the bill, you clear. But if you buy, you take turn to buy the bill, that trigger a continuity of that relationship. So for me, also a lot of questions asked about quantification of the care and reunion, but actually that is in a way that almost deliberately having that kind of flaws, because if you exchange the activity actually doesn't really always equate to each other, right? So there's an ongoing kind of indebtedness in there, but that was work as some kind of emotional drive for you to continue the relationship. And then because it that kind of specific collaborative money that you're having together, that also became an ongoing drive for you to constantly renegotiate, instead of just thinking that everything can be equal all the time. I think that if you have a relationship that is equal all the time, you don't have a relationship. You have a purchase. That's all. So for me, yeah, the debt there, I think, yeah, again, to reiterate, the currency system that we have somehow absorbing that take away of that potential hoarding, but at the same time it's still leaving the emotional debt in that sense to drive that relationship going.
I might end really quickly. I think if we just think about maybe the concept of pooling and then how you might situate that as a concept as a format of exchange in terms of debt. I think that this is for me and whether it's emotional or not, and how that obviously is situated in relationships. So that's sort of the conceptual playground that I'm when I hear that word, I'm just okay, what's happening between those terms? So yeah.
That happens between us. And anything else we can? Yeah.
Maybe let's just change the concept of debt to abundance, and we can end on abundance.
Cool. Sounds good. All right, thank you very much. Thanks so much.